Well, I think they were well intentioned. I think that the problem that they faced in the long term was the structural one, which is that in the end, the US and China are embarked on very different pathways and they just don't converge in the ways that you would want them to. So, and this goes sort of across the board from geopolitical kinds of objectives to trade to economics to human rights. So, I mean, I think that they were temporarily stabilizing, but I think the long-term trajectory is the problem.
Sir, of course, you listened to Donald Trump's, of course, statements when he said that he is going to be applying 25% tariffs on any trade, specifically in China. How do you read this, sir?
Well, I think this is a going in position. We know from the past and from his own statements that Donald Trump likes to sort of go in high and hard, as it were, on trade deals. He wants to sort of set out very ambitious objectives and then negotiate down from there. So I think this is him sort of laying out a marker, letting Xi Jinping and China know that this is, he intends to drive a hard bargain. And I think this is kind of typical of what we've seen of Donald Trump in the past.
Sir, do you think that the diplomatic visits by U.S. will be any impact or will have any impact on the relations between China and the United States?
Well, I think that, visits by senior officials tend to have fairly limited impact, really, because ultimately the decision maker in Beijing is Xi Jinping himself. Understanding Donald Trump and his statements, I think, goes to understanding that he himself views himself as a destabilizer. In other words, he sees things oftentimes as being stable in the wrong place, and so he wants to temporarily destabilize things so that he can get them to the place that he prefers. So stability isn't necessarily going to be his going-in objective.
You mean, sir, in his style of negotiation as a businessman, how could Congress's potential reconsideration of China's trade status reshape U.S.-China's economic relations, sir?
Well, certainly if Congress were to pass legislation that withdraws China's most favored nation trading status, that would be very significant as far as not just U.S.-China trade, but the world system that has become very accustomed to most favored nation status for China over the last quarter century. So that would be a very disruptive event, which is not to say that it shouldn't happen, because China is probably the world's foremost cheater, if you will, on trade. It systematically subsidizes its own industries in contravention of a lot of the principles of free trade, and steals intellectual property and those kinds of things. So it would be a huge deal. I'm not sure that it'll happen.
Okay, sir, how significant was the United States travel warning for China in illustrating the state of bilateral trust?
Look, I think the travel warning is a real one. I mean, there are actual human beings who get trapped in China and accused of crimes and can't get out. And so, the travel warning comes down first and foremost as a warning. It's not just a diplomatic tool. It's actually trying to protect Americans who might think going through China is safe, but there are examples now of people who are stuck there and can't get out. And that, not only is that bad for those people, it's also bad for the United States and the U.S.-China relationship because it complicates negotiations on other things. The U.S. has to try to get those people back. And to some degree, they are being used as negotiating chips by China.
Sir, to what extent is the United States focused on economic competition with China affecting broader geopolitical stability?
Well, I mean, I think that there is, at least domestically, there is a lot of focus on China's unfair trade practices, and to the extent to which a lot of Americans believe they disadvantage themselves. They disadvantage Americans. So, and I think that Donald Trump focuses very much on this himself. So I think that's a real concern of sort of ordinary Americans. I'd say there's sort of official Washington, which is very concerned about China's geopolitical trends, which are becoming extremely aggressive and extremely confrontational across the globe. You look at sort of across the Taiwan Strait and in the South China Sea and places like this, where we are seeing a very muscular China trying to impose its will on its neighbors, many of whom the U.S. has treaty alliances and very close relationships with.
Okay, do you foresee cooperation between the United and China on global issues like climate change and cybersecurity despite the increasing tension, sir?
I think both of those issues are very problematic for U.S.-China relations. First of all, on climate change, first the Trump administration is unlikely to prioritize climate change. It did not campaign on having a strong stance on climate change. And I think it's very skeptical that China uses climate change in negotiations as a way to sort of, again, disadvantage the United States, and sort of offer things that it doesn't intend to follow up on. I think with cybersecurity, that's the problem there is we're looking at a massive hack of U.S. telecoms that is just coming out in the Salt Typhoon hack that is going to dominate the U.S. news for a little while. So cooperation with China on cybersecurity has to begin with figuring out exactly to what extent is China the problem on cybersecurity rather than the solution.
Sir, are you optimistic that there will be a meeting point between both countries?
I think there will be meetings, but I think, again, the problem is that the imperatives of both countries are, once again, moving in very different directions.
Yes.
China is what we often will call a revisionist state, which means that it wants to revise the world system that has sort of prevailed since the end of World War II, believing that now that China is strong, it deserves a much stronger space in that system, and that means pulling away from a lot of the structures that are there now. And so, for example, in the South China Sea, there's international law that says that certain international standards apply, but China believes that they shouldn't apply in the South China Sea because that is rightfully Chinese owned. And so that brings us to loggerheads. And that's just one example amongst scores of examples of places where China just wants to move in a very different direction than the U.S. and the West.